Good evening. Hello, I'm Akanksha Rastogi, Senior Curator, Programming and Exhibitions at the Kiran Museum of Art. A very warm welcome to everyone joining us today for this very special lecture by Shahed Saleem, an architect contemplates diasporic longing, after which he'll be in conversation with Annapurna Garimella. This is the second lecture, part of 6 sessions conceptualized by Annapurna Garimella, that take the idea of research in practice to explore how scholars, curators, architects, publishers, and artists reflect on the way they think and how they shape their inquiries. And she's beautifully titled this set as Crafting Thought. And so all these wonderful conversations and propositions that we are gathering from different scholars and artists are all nested in our larger series, Research as Practice, which we initiated last year at KNMA. And since then, many speakers have been part of it, and all the previous lectures are available on our YouTube, on the museum's YouTube channel. So you can access them at your ease. And with this Research as Practice series, our primary aim has been to explore what is research in a museum and exhibitionary contexts, and to elaborately investigate and understand deeply what is pedagogy, learning, and research outside the academic institutions or universities, and also to focus on subjectivity in research practices by inviting practitioners to open up their work and research in more personal ways. So in this series, we've tried to place together the researcher, the practitioner, and also the subject of research, to see research and life together in some ways. And the last lecture we had, which happened in early March by Sankalpa, was very inspiring. I personally found it really inspiring, and I'm still thinking about it. And he spoke so beautifully and elaborately about the body as measure and apparatus in architecture, and particularly about the maker's body. So how the maker's body embodies knowledge and carries the stability of the ideas and thoughts that gets transferred into different materials. And so this kind of mutuality and arcs that he was drawing between structure, material, and the maker's body was amazing. And today with Shahed Saleem's lecture, and his fieldwork, we hope to get into the ideas of a mosque and as a built structure and the expressions of diasporic longing in architectural forms. So I'm very grateful to Annapurna and Shahed for agreeing to our invitation, and it's a privilege to have you here, both of you. So I would like to, before I hand it over to Annapurna to take us through this evening, I would just like to add that the museum just reopened. We've reopened the museum space with 2 exhibitions. So please come visit us. We look forward to seeing you and in a physical refurbished space. Very excited. So over to you, Annapurna. Thank you.
Mazel tov. Congratulations on reopening it, or Mubarak, whichever way we go, swing it with today. Okay, so thank you so much. And I want to thank all the team at KNMA for organizing this, and Akanksha, you, for inviting me to do this talk. And I would really like to begin by sharing with you why I invited Shahed Saleem. So I have not met Shahed before. We have met only online. And my interest in his work was sparked by this book that is a catalog of a project he did with a group of other people for the V&A. And for the Venice Biennale, the Architecture Biennale. And then I started probing it further, and I really felt something was very emotional about this work, and I really wanted to enter it deeply in a conversation that was shared with other people. In my own work, religious architecture, contemporary religious architecture is a profound intellectual, emotional, commitment. If you hear my accent, I have a very thick mid-Atlantic accent. So I grew up in India. I was born in India, but I went to the United States when I was 8 years old. And when I was 12 and 13, actually 13, 14, we moved to Houston, Texas, and my mother was very closely involved in the construction of a Meenakshi temple in Houston, Texas. And that was a very profound experience for me because I watched very closely and did a lot of work. And Shahed and I've discussed this a little bit, but I'll let him do this. A lot of work in doing the dog's body work, making flyers, printing things, stapling things, giving it to people, counting out money, all that kind of stuff. And in that very small work for making a big thing like a Hindu temple, a Meenakshi temple nonetheless, I watched my mother's own devotional orientation and how she took it forward into the rest of the community and how the rest of the community allied itself with her. And it was also a time period when house temples in the United States were slowly coming to a closure, I think, by and large. They're still there in small parts, smaller towns in the United States, but purpose-built temples were being made in near Pittsburgh and in Houston, and Stapatis were being invited from India, and priests were also being invited from India. And it showed a kind of confidence in creating smaller communities within this larger Indian diasporic community, Indian Hindu diasporic community. So when I invited Shahed, what I really wanted to do was to share a conversation with him, with many people, where we could explore what does it mean to see a community transform. He's a second generation British migrant. I'm not going to British Muslim. His parents are migrants to England. What does it mean to see this from childhood, a community transform? How does it impact your own thinking about community, about worship, about architecture? How does a practicing architect think about religious architecture, making religious architecture? And that's a big conversation because a few years ago, I forget which magazine, architecture magazine it was, it asked the question, can the modern be sacred? And I'm always curious about that kind of question, and we'll explore it through his work and then we'll take it forward. I invite all of you to please raise your hands if you'd like to ask your question to Shahed on your own. But if you'd like to type it into the Q&A, then I'm happy to read it for you. I know we're all operating with different kinds of bandwidths and internet stabilities. So thank you, Shahed, for so readily agreeing, and I really, really appreciate you speaking to us today.
That's great. Thank you very much, Annapurna and Kanchi and the museum for organizing this talk and for inviting me to present some work, but also to have this really, what I think is going to be a fascinating and interesting and useful conversation for me, particularly as well, in terms of thinking about my own work. Based on the series that the talks that I've already seen of the series and in the conversations that I've had so far with Annapurna as well, I'm very interested and curious to take that forward and to be part of this project. Right, oopsie daisy, I'll do the, let me get my slides up here. Right. So I'm going to talk about some of my work, my architectural practice in relation to the design of the mosques in Britain, working with communities, Muslim communities, migrant Muslim communities here in Britain, mostly in London. And my work has been focused. And also I'm going to look at my work and try and place it within a sort of a broader social, political, cultural context of post-war migration and social change in the UK. And I'm going to also talk about how my own research into the history of the mosque, the architectural and social history of the mosque in Britain, which resulted in a publication of a book in 2018, how I've used that to also understand the work that I do myself as a practitioner. So a lot of what I will talk about and what I explore is really that relationship between being a practitioner of architectural practice, making buildings, working with communities, so kind of implementing and working with the kind of aspirations of migrant Muslim community groups, and also of being a observer and a researcher, and trying to make a kind of a sort of an understanding, or trying to come to some kind of an understanding or interpretation of that field of architecture. So to start with, I'll talk about my architectural practice, which started in Bethnal Green, which is a district of East London, in the early 2000s. And it started as a small general practice, and it survived, or perhaps even thrived, because we were in a multi-ethnic part of the inner city, and we served a largely ethnic minority clientele of small developers, householders, businesses, community organizations, and so on. Now, London provided a commercial base for sure, but also a spiritual home for me, because being of second generation Indian heritage, and London being a city whose population was declared majority minority. So the majority of the London population is made up of minorities by 2011. One of the groups of people who started to approach me were mosques in the East End of London. It's an area with a high Muslim population, and historically it's been a landing point where migrants would first settle, would first arrive, settle, and then move on, if you like. So these projects would vary in scale and scope, from extending, adapting, and rebuilding to purpose-built mosques. From the outset, I was keen to adopt an architectural approach that questioned the visual language that mosques in the UK were starting to employ, where domes, minarets, and arches from historic Islamic buildings drawn from across the Muslim world were being replicated, rescaled, reproportioned, or altered to fit this new British context. So I started to think about whether it was possible to use the architectural language of the British mosque to represent and express the complexities of migrant diasporic identity. One of the earlier mosques that I started working on was the Beit al-Aman in Bethnal Green. They were operating out of a series of temporary cabins, and you can see this image of the earlier mosque. And they sought to redevelop these into a purpose-built mosque. This was immediately, for me, it became a site of experimentation, and I tried to recombine or reinterpret traditional mosque elements into a new formal language. And through this, I sought to explore how what I felt could be a new contemporary form of Islamic architecture might be expressed. And I was trying to express contemporaneity, as well as referencing the cultural heritage of the community. Around the same time, I started working on another mosque project for a site in South London. This time a series of shops with residential upper floors, which had been acquired one by one and combined into the mosque and its facilities. And this one actually, and we'll probably talk about this more, Annapurna mentioned the working with her kind of parents as a child, developing establishing a temple in the US. This was actually the mosque that my parents also established in Southeast London. So my mum, as with Annapurna's experience, my mum was very much involved in spearheading a project to establish a mosque in Southeast London, because there was no facility there, and it was very much a kind of starting from scratch process of finding a sort of local Muslim communities, connecting and finding a site, buying it, and so on. And then this was the second site that the mosque moved to, which was, it gradually started to acquire a series of these terraced buildings, and then connecting them one by one. So the mosque facility was kind of growing into this sort of Victorian architectural block, if you like. And then I was looking at how to then start to lay another kind of architectural language over the top of that, to try to start to create a kind of coherent Islamic architectural language over the top of this kind of iterative process of making. So this was kind of one of the early proposals for that. You can see the terrace of houses here, shops and houses. And then a later project in Camberwell in South London. This was the redevelopment of a former public house, a pub. In this, I incorporated an abstracted version of Islamic pattern work to create a composition for a new facade to clad the pub building and to extend it as well. And I started with the pattern and then started with a more traditional pattern and then turned it into a sort of abstracted form. So in this way, overlaying the 1960s pub building with a new visual language and giving it then a new architectural, social and cultural meaning. One of my earliest built projects was the Chaperon Mosque on Hackney Road in East London. And here I took a tile pattern, and this is an image of the mosque before the work that I did to it. So what you see is the mosque was in an adapted house, which was the end of this terrace. So they were using the house as the mosque with sort of small internal adaptations. And then at the back of it, there was this single story workshop, and it was that workshop was going to be rebuilt. And then also the house was going to be redeveloped and refurbished to sort of house the mosque as well. So I took a tile pattern that is found in Islamic cultures of Central Asia, and I rescaled it to use it as the basis for a design for the facade of the building. So rather than a literal replication of this historic motif, I was interested in a more abstracted and a more, if you like, fragmented reapplication. The geometric pattern of the Anatolian tile is decentered when it becomes the scale of the facade, and part of it is lost. So on that image on the right, you can see how the tile sits over only part of the facade of the building, or becomes part of the facade of the building. So in pulling historical references across what I describe as a colonial rupture, and I'll talk more about that, what I'm saying, what I'm arguing is that you inevitably lose fragments. You lose context, you lose metaphors, and it comes across this rupture as an incomplete fragment. So in applying this to a street in East London, you're engaged in an act of invention. And that's my one of my core arguments or understandings, is that we are reinventing rather than restoring through this process, through this diasporic migrant kind of process of making. I deployed a similar approach to Islamic pattern and contemporary abstraction in the mosque I designed in Aberdeen. So this is the Hackney Road images, you can see here, just plans of the building. And this is the site for the mosque in Aberdeen. And with this one, I was looking at different ways in which, again, pattern work could be reused and adapted and developed to create, again, a kind of a new invention, as it were. So here I used a traditional Islamic pattern eventually. And this drawing we were looking at worked with an artist, and we were looking at how Celtic geometric pattern work, so pattern work that was local to the region, could be sort of like fused and hybridized and developed to show its kind of like emergence into a sort of more kind of Islamic geometries. So the way in which two types of kind of sacred geometries would be overlaid and intertwined. And then I worked with an artist, Lubna Chowdhury, who's a ceramic artist based here in London, and she made a series of star shapes. So these again, sort of based on traditional Islamic geometries, but reinterpreting the actual pattern work of those, and then giving each of them a kind of a new sort of set of colors and so on. And they became stars which were placed within the pattern grid that I created for the mosque. So a traditional Islamic pattern here is casting concrete panels, and it forms the dominant part of the front facade. And then the ceramic tiles are placed within each of those. Each ceramic tile is slightly different. And then the other parts of the facade are made with a contemporary concrete cast pattern and granite blockwork on the ground floor to reference the materiality of the street. So in this way, the architecture of the mosque becomes a frame onto which a composition of visual and historic references are assembled. In each of these projects, I sort of use architecture as a metaphor. That's my kind of idea, a metaphor to represent the condition of the Muslim diaspora. So that's what I'm trying to explore through the projects. this one is a mosque in Folkestone, where, again, I was looking at extending the front of it. But this project was part of a wider sort of engagement with the mosque through an arts festival that takes place in Folkestone called the Folkestone Triennial. And in that art project, I worked with two artists, Simon Davenport and Hoi Chong Wong. And we created an installation which was situated at the front of the mosque, which was put up for the festival and is actually still there. And the installation is a kind of lantern which lights up in different light patterns. And then the panels are made from workshops that we did with the children who attend the mosque. So we went down to the beach because Folkestone is a small town on the coast of England, south coast. And we collected things, and then the children made drawings, and then they made prints. And then from the prints, we created a series of abstracted patterns, and those patterns were made as tiles onto the installation, but also those patterns will become the facade of the proposed buildings. A part of the project is that on the one hand there's an installation, but there's a longer part of the project, which is that the building will be extended and redeveloped, and it will be a sort of a new facility for the Muslim community there. And so I was then interested in working with the community to develop a new visual language which could be incorporated into the architecture of the future building. So from the drawings that the children made, I developed these patterns or kind of abstracted shapes, which would be placed within a sort of a more regular kind of Islamic shape, which is that hexagonal form, the six-sided hexagon. And but the interior is the pattern that was developed through the workshop. So it means that, so that would become the facade of the building, which becomes this kind of lattice work, which again is references back to kind of historic sort of Mashrabiya, the Mashrabiya technology, I suppose, of traditional Islamic architecture. But again, it has a different kind of manifestation. These are plans of the building as it would be extended. And this is a visual of the front, so you can see how that pattern would start to be composed. So the idea being that the building itself speaks a number of different languages, and it comes from a number of different sources. So it has a kind of echo of sort of the Islamic architectural tradition within it, but it also has a particular pattern work which is developed from these kind of contemporary engagements with the diasporic communities. So my understanding, so in each of the projects I'm using architecture becomes this exercise or this kind of metaphor to represent and to work through the condition of diasporic identities. And my understanding of this condition is based on how I've processed my own lived experience as a second generation migrant, as well as how I've researched British Muslim history. I therefore oscillate between being both subject and object of the analysis from which my architectural concepts emerge. I very quickly talk about my teaching practice as well, because I know that's something that we wanted to bring into the conversation. And I've taught for 5 or 6 years now at the University of Westminster undergraduate design studio, and also do postgraduate dissertation history and theory work. But with my design studio, I have the opportunity to develop certain lines of inquiry and present those and work through those with students. And it's really after Annapurna asked me to sort of think about it and talk about it that I started to think back and look at, okay, what is the kind of pattern in the work that I've done in the studio? And there's a list here that I made of the kind of themes that we've looked at year on year. So this year we're looking at museums, but museums in particular, we're looking at the idea of kind of objects in museums, the kind of the provenance of objects, how do they get there? What are the stories that are told through those objects, and what is the kind of meaning of those objects, and who tells the stories? And then our project is looking at how do we retell narratives through new types of museum. Previously, we looked at public space, previously that kind of how histories are embedded within urban environments. Another year, we looked at how rituals are enacted within urban environments as well. We looked at the idea of an intercultural cities, so cities where there are diverse cultures and where are the kind of points of overlap and connection and interaction, where do they happen in the urban space? And then the first year that I was teaching, we were looking at the subject of migration and migration into cities, and how cities become kind of places of kind of like migrant movements and histories and so on. So all of my teaching work as well. There's the work that I take into the studio explores themes around the urban, but it explores themes around the kind of social, cultural, and how they are enacted within urban and architectural spaces. And that again further kind of it's drawn from my research inquiries and practice work, but it also informs that as well. And we'll talk more about that, I think, as we go on. One of the ways in which I sort of describe this kind of diasporic condition, or try to understand this diasporic condition, is one of a kind of rupture, and the idea of colonialism and colonization as a break, and as a kind of violent break between cultures which had a continuous historical trajectory, and that trajectory is then interrupted, and then people try to reconstruct or recreate that trajectory on the other side of that colonial break, and in this case as diasporas. So colonialism breaks things, it shatters an imagined wholeness. The colonial rupture is social, psychological, cultural, and economic equivalent of a paradigm shift. Words and relations on either side of the colonial rupture are incommensurate. So I'm very interested in this idea that the rupture represents a fundamental kind of paradigmatic break, which cannot be bridged potentially. And if not, then what is it that we try to do? Well, what is it that diasporas are trying to do, or to what extent can that attempt to bridge the rupture, if that's what is being attempted, be successful? But let's think a little more about the impact of post-colonial migration on the diasporic subject, because it's somewhere in here that my own various subject positions are situated, and it is this which my work negotiates. The Indian-American psychoanalyst Salman Akhtar talks about the pain of migration and cumulative trauma on the migrant ego. He describes how, according to human developmental terms, he describes that in early infancy there is something called synesthesia, where one sensation can be replaced by another. So colors become sound, sound replaces touch, and so on. And it's something that we can experience in dreams, he says. Now, he says that in normal ego growth, this synesthesia develops into sensory compartmentalization. And a person living in their normal, familiar environment can cross and recross this ambiguous terrain between synesthesia and sensory compartmentalization many times. And it is this crossing and recrossing which is the foundation of metaphor. So the ability to go between the sort of separation or categorization of sensory experience, and between allowing that to be more kind of fluid, and being able to go between is, according to him, where metaphor emerges. And one of the major problems with early immigration, Akhtar argues, is the loss of this ability to move back and forth between the fluid and the fixed, and therefore the loss of metaphor, and the replacement of metaphor with literalness, and what he calls a linguistic regression in the mind. Now, Akhtar offers further analysis of the diasporic psychic condition that results from the rupture of migration. He lists a number of attitudes and fantasies that the migrant adopts. Firstly, there is the attitude of repudiation, a sensory denial of being in a new place. Then there is the fantasy of return, which is continuously delayed until, in most cases, it is abandoned. After this comes the fantasy of replication. And that is, if return is not possible, then the migrant will remake their lost homeland in the new place. Such replication is a way for the migrant to deny the loss and to minimize what he calls the laceration of the self that they have suffered. Objects, then, that are used in this process of replication take on what Akhtar describes as a shamanic and totemic significance, onto which are transferred the traumas of dislocation and the loss of that environment that emplaced the person in the world. Now, my argument, or my sort of some contention, is that the architecture of the diaspora mosque becomes an instrument through which to reimagine and reconstruct the historical and cultural trajectories of migrants that have been interrupted. So the architecture of the mosque in a way becomes that object onto which these traumas are being transferred potentially. So the architecture of the mosque is an attempt to bridge somehow this gap. However, for me, attempts to reconstruct across this divide, across this kind of colonial and migrant divide by diasporas, is inevitably a partial and incomplete process. Reconstruction must navigate a real an imagined past and a new present. And this negotiation changes both the diaspora and the host. So this attempt to reconstruct, it has to happen. You have to look back to a past, but you exist in a present, which is quite a different place. And trying to negotiate those gaps, try to negotiate that space, is an act of reinvention. That's my take on it at the moment. So in the attempt to reconstruct, I contend the diaspora is equally engaged in this act of reinvention. Now, I'll talk a little bit about the emergence of British Muslim architecture here in the UK, just to give a bit of an understanding of how that is, how that typology now can be, how I've tried to interpret or understand the typology of the mosque in Britain. The first, these are kind of images of early built mosques from the kind of 60s to the 90s. However, the first mosque in Britain appeared as a folly in Kew Gardens in 1963, alongside a Chinese pagoda and other manifestations of non-European cultures. It served as a representation of Islam and Muslim architecture to a Western audience, the symbol of a distant other, complete with a central dome and two flanking minarets in a broadly Ottoman style. The first functioning purpose-built mosque in Britain was built in Woking, and this was built by local architect William Chambers, and it encapsulated a late Victorian fashion for the Oriental, with flamboyant arches, crenellations, cupulas, and domes. Now, this practice of representing cultures being encountered through the colonial enterprise as exotic, idealized, picturesque, and sometimes fantastical was familiar in Europe through the 18th and 19th centuries and came to be known as the Orientalist genre in painting, literature, architecture, and so on. And as Edward Said wrote, from the beginning of Western speculation about the Orient, the one thing the Orient could not do was to represent itself. Evidence of the Orient was credible only after it had passed through and been made firm by the refining fire of the Orientalists' work. After World War II, with the advent of decolonization, large numbers of Muslims settled in Britain from certain parts of South Asia, and the Muslim population increased rapidly. A handful of mosques, mostly in port cities, followed Woking until at the end of the Second World War and the partition of India, mosques of the early post-war years were rudimentary operations. They were formed mostly from converted houses or other buildings which were adapted to serve a new religious function. And now this portability of Islamic rituals meant that a mosque could be created with the most elemental of alterations, such as the opening up of domestic rooms to form prayer halls, adapting bathrooms to create ablution facilities, and extending into gardens. These mosques of the diaspora differed from Orientalist visions of the mosques at Woking and Kew, but only perhaps because they lacked the resources. The post-war mosques were being self-made in an iterative and ad hoc fashion by migrant communities who were using them. These are sort of types of mosque buildings that emerged after World War II. There was the houses that were converted through various rudimentary adaptations and then extensions and so on, and then the conversion of other types of buildings, warehouses, banks, churches, all kinds of things, cinema halls, and then the purpose-built. And often the purpose-built mosques came at the end of kind of like a long process of evolution and iteration of a particular site. So, for example, in terms of buildings that have been adapted but are drawing directly from historical sources, the Islamic Centre of Brent, this image here, was founded in a former congregational church dating from 1908, built in a Free Gothic style. The mosque, which was founded by Pakistani migrants, made limited alterations to the exterior. However, most dramatically, they added domes to the tower and to a small front extension which served as the mihrab. These domes are replicas of those found on the 17th century Jama Mosque in Delhi. So while these examples can be traced back to a historical origin, such lineage is not always clear. In many, if not most cases, the Islamic architectural references replicated on post-war mosques are more generic, or approximations of historic Islamic architecture from places where Muslim empires once ruled. The Nur al-Islam Mosque in Bolton, for example, has a dome which is similar to the Ottoman-built dome of the Prophet's Mosque in Medina, while loosely Mughal-style arch or dome shapes are cut into the gables. What unites these two examples is that their architectural language was assembled by the communities who were using them rather than designed by a design professional. This was the case for most mosques from the 1960s to the mid-1990s, that they were self-designed by their users. And this has resulted in an architectural period of mosque history, which I describe as an Islamic vernacular tradition. The Victoria and Albert Museum's Pavilion of Applied Arts at the Venice Biennale last year, 2021, took this period of mosque making as its subject. The exhibition, curated by myself, Christopher Turner, and Ella Kilgallen, reproduced architectural fragments of 3 London mosques, which can all be identified as self-designed from the 1970s to the 1990s. Each mosque represented a certain type of adaptation. Brick Lane Mosque, which is this one, was established in 1976. It was a former church, then a synagogue. It was built originally in 1743. Harrow Mosque was fashioned from a pair of semi-detached houses in the early 1980s. And Old Kent Road Mosque was adapted from a public house in the 1990s. The pavilion, our exhibition, focused on this period of mosque architecture in Britain, as it encapsulates the period of mosque making by migrants from former British colonies, which helped transform British society in the post-war period. Our exhibition, therefore, intended to describe that period of mosque making before it becomes completely superseded by purpose-built mosques and the professionalization of mosque design. So here you can see the exhibition that was installed in Venice, and what we did is we made one-to-one sort of facsimiles or replicas of parts of those mosque buildings that had been created through the adaptation of the existing buildings. And this, for example, is the wall in the Old Kent Road Mosque, which was a former Victorian pub. And this is kind of one of the kind of wall sets that was recreated, showing the kind of interior decoration of the pub and how that was painted and adapted and overlaid with the kind of new Islamic sort of language. This is the mihrab of the Harrow Mosque, which was made by the chairman of the mosque, who travels to Pakistan and had this built by a carpenter there and brought it back and then installed it in the mosque, and that served in the house mosque as the mihrab. And this is the Old Kent Road Mosque on the left, because during the period of the Biennale, the Victorian former public house that was the Old Kent Road Mosque was demolished, and work has now commenced on its new build replacement, which is designed by East London architect Umaira Waheed. As well as celebrating the mosque in its self-built phase, the V&A Pavilion frames this architecture as a British Muslim vernacular, and recognizing it as a significant phase of Muslim architecture and cultural history. Now, this is not simply a desire to categorize, but rather to understand through the lens of the vernacular, the cultural and political agency of the mosque. One of the things I've tried to explore the qualities of this self-built mosque has been, before I sort of talk about that, these are just images of, this is a photograph, for example, of the rebuilding of one of the mosque sites. And here you can see how the members of the mosque community are very actively involved in laying out. In this case, it's about deciding on where and how the mihrab will be placed and how it will be used. So within this kind of, building site that's going on, and a completely new building is being built, the community are still very much involved in a kind of hands-on way of making design decisions as the building is being built. So drawing is one thing, but actually what they want to do is to go there, stand on the site and enact how the building will be used, mark it out on the ground, and then that becomes the place where, in this case, the mihrab will be built. So one of the ways in which I try to explore the qualities of that, the self-built period before this new build period starts, has been through drawings that are made on research visits and trips. These drawings are part remembered and part invented assemblages of diaspora mosques encountered in British townscapes. They serve as my own visual documentation for possible future use. From the late 1990s, a new wave of purpose-built mosques started to emerge, which were procured more according to the norms of standard construction projects. This is to say, a professional designer was employed to design or envisage the mosque as a complete and coherent object, and it was then built. So design intention and building execution were separate spheres of activity carried out by different specialists. The resulting buildings were no longer ad hoc or freestyle combinations of disparate architectural elements, which characterized the self-built adapted mosque period of the previous decades, but they were now aspiring to be more complete and coherent Islamic architecture, more specifically rooted in the past. The 1996 Bilal Mosque in Leeds, is this one here, is perhaps the initiator of this trend, designed by the Bradford-based Iraqi-born structural engineer Atba al-Samarai. It presents an architectural language that is fully rooted in Islamic sources, adapted though they may be for this context. Indeed, there is not necessarily any accuracy in the way in which diasporas source their traditional Islamic references, both for the self-built and ad hoc mosques, nor for the intentionally designed ones. Medina Masjid in Sheffield, completed in 2002, is another similar example by Al-Samarai, where somewhat generic Islamic sources are deployed which cannot be specifically placed to a period of Islamic architectural history. This academic liberalness is not always the case, however. The Jamia Mosque in Leicester, completed in 2010, draws its Islamic references more recognizably from the 12th century Fatimid mosques of Cairo. The mosque has been formed through the extension and recladding of a former industrial premises, with the decorated paneling, decorative elements, minarets, and dome being formed from glass reinforced plastic. The architects for this building were sourced from the United Arab Emirates, as the mosque committee did not feel that any UK architects were sufficiently experienced in Muslim architecture to deliver an adequate design. Now, there is a historical juncture, even though there is a certain kind of historical accuracy that this building attempts. There is still a disconnect in the fact that the mosque was founded by and mostly serves a Gujarati Indian community with no ties to the Fatimid dynasty. This suggests that diasporic Muslim communities are satisfied with a pan-Islamic identity which can range temporally and geographically across the Muslim world and its history, rather than needing to adhere to an ethno-centered one. This delinking of diaspora communities from their specific historical trajectories and their absorption into a broader global community is another consequence and condition of migration. The Sufatul Islam Mosque in Bradford is a further example of this historicist approach to mosque design in Britain. Here, the mosque is impressively sized with multiple minarets and domes. The red sandstone facing was sourced from the Indian city of Agra, as were many of the sandstone details and decorative elements. Now, let me just talk a little bit about, I'll talk a little bit about kind of practices of othering and kind of racialization that sort of take place here in Britain and kind of Northern Europe. It's obviously a big topic. I'll just say a few things about that just to bring that into the conversation. So the interconnections and dependencies between race, capital, colonization, and climate are well established, but are recently gaining wider recognition. In Race and Modern Architecture, collected essays by Cheng, Davis, and Wilson, the editors articulate how modernity is, as they say, a product of the intertwined forces of capitalism, slavery, and empire. They argue that coloniality and modernity exist as two sides of the same coin. Ideologies of European scientific progress and rationalism were put into the service in the construction of racial difference and informed architectural thought. Architecture responded with historicist frameworks that stressed development in time and produced what they call hierarchical linear chronologies that place non-white human groups at an earlier or lower stage of cultural development, while representing white European and American populations and their cultural outfits as the most advanced edge of civilization and progress. The privileging of modern architecture required positioning other building traditions as non-modern, vernacular, or primitive. Modernism then served as a philosophical, technical, stylistic, and aesthetic movement promoted through educational and professional institutions. Now, criticism of the mosque in Britain can be seen to have roots in these architectural ideologies of modernity and progress versus tradition and backwardness. The mosque has broadly been cast as an alien, foreign, and of representing a culture out of step with Britishness, with democratic values, and unable to exist alongside and indeed within a liberal secular nation. The racist discourses between such views are obscured. They are couched instead as rational objections. Indeed, the English Defence League's anti-Muslim rhetoric has been described as a rational Islamophobia, which is a socially acceptable form of racism, also common among media, politicians, and intellectuals. The historicist versus progressive debate in mosque architecture does become conflated with politicized debates about British Muslim identity and culture. So this question around the kind of, should the mosque be modern or should it be a kind of traditional drawing on historic references, or should it somehow be evolving into a new contemporary British or English style, is one that reverberates through the discussion. So the mosque in Britain is caught between discourses of historicism and contemporaneity, and it's the site through which debates of regressive versus progressive are played out in architectural form. So I will conclude really on this point, that mine within this debate and this kind of discussion is a ambivalent position, because in one way, I see that the migrant Muslim diasporic communities who seek to replicate historic Islamic tropes are taking control of their own self-image in the way that, for example, Said was criticizing the kind of Orientalist practice, whereby the subject has no way of representing themselves. So on the one hand, do these kind of historicist, ad hoc, self-built, self-designed buildings, are they a demonstration of this, you might call subaltern, or of the minority of the diaspora taking control of their own self-image? But on the other hand, do they internalize the Orientalist vision of the East as it's been articulated by the Muslim world? So are they an act in the way of kind of self-orientalization, tying themselves to a literal reading of mythic Islamic history, and kind of reducing the complex and history of Islam into a series of simple archetypes? There are therefore a series of overlapping discourses around who is in control of the discursive formations through which identities of post-colonial diasporas are made and articulated. The mosque users, through their rejection of a dominant architectural agenda, raised the question of whether the mosque in Britain, marginalized by the architectural, artistic, cultural academy, actually represents one of the most successful and determined forms of cultural resistance to continued cultural hegemony of post-coloniality and beyond. And so is this building type and is this form of architecture actually one of the most politicized and culturally significant types of architecture in late 20th century Britain? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your beautiful presentation, and you've laid out your practice and situated it in such a gorgeous way. I'd like to just begin by asking you a few questions, and I again invite all the people who have joined the conversation to please either raise your hand or type in your questions in the Q&A. Let me just begin by just sticking to the buildings, and then we'll expand from there. So I have read your 2018 book, and in that there are 3 out of many that I have chosen, 4 actually. One is the Cardiff Peel Street Mosque. felt very emotional when I saw the picture of the people gathering in the road. And then you also put in a picture of the dilapidated state of the mosque before it was torn down. There was another very interesting perspectival view of Davies Llewellyn, I think is how you say it, perspectival view, where you have turrets and a dome in operating in parallel, almost walking hand in hand with each other. And then the Gamkol Sharif Mosque, which is, again, very, very moving. And then, of course, the Edinburgh Central Mosque, which is the Scottish baronial turret and the Minar, again, walking parallel next to each other. So my first question to you is, how do you derive a language, a poetics of architecture language when you both research and write about these kinds of endeavors, as well as your own practice?
That's that's a sort of ongoing, partly dilemma, but also partly that's what for me I find very is what kind of stimulates me, because what happens is through the research work, it forces one to have to check your own sort of drive, if you like, or check your own kind of motivations and aspirations. It serves as a sort of maybe a sense check. I mean, maybe that's whether that's a good or bad thing, I don't know, but that's what it kind of does. So, for example, it's really through the research that I was doing in the field that I was doing, so meeting Muslim communities and people who had made the mosques and talking to them about the processes by which that they'd gone through to establish and then create their buildings, and kind of seeing the huge efforts that really people made over long periods of time, decades, and really kind of put their whole kind of like lives actually into these projects, and the way in which people were so invested in the buildings of these things. It's very seldom that you see people so invested in architecture, if it's not your own house. And then understanding seeing that the kind of symbolism and language was very important to the people in their processes and acts of making, and then seeing that architectural language, the traditions or historicist language, as part of the formation of identities over a long period of time, then realizing that, and then there being a disjunction between coming from a modern or kind of contemporary architectural, mindset, which rejects sort of historicist approaches, and it kind of rejects repetition, if you like, and it's always kind of seeking newness. So understanding sort of the way people have made buildings, I think has brought me to a place where I sort of understand the importance of incorporating that into any kind of new design language that happens, rather than designing as a criticism of that work that has happened. So what it's made me think about is that the architectural tradition that we can draw on is actually already here. So new Muslim architecture now can draw on a tradition that is here. It doesn't have to necessarily look to places that are further afield, if you like, because I mean, that could obviously be useful and it can have a role, but I think largely we can now draw on a tradition that we have, which is here in Britain, and so there may be a certain kind of indigenization that could potentially take place now. And I'm interested in that process of sort of doing that. So the work with the Folkestone Mosque, where what I wanted to sort of explore was, how do we generate a language which starts here and now? So it started with the kids making their drawings and prints. I'm sure I interpreted that and I brought my own kind of authorship into that, for sure. But I wanted to be able to draw it back to the present in some way, but then also reflect it, to connect also again to this kind of longer history, because that's what people want as well. People do want to, the people who are using it want that connection, and that's kind of important as well.
So to continue with that question, I have, in some of the images that you showed us in your books and even in your lecture today, the kiblation, that is the orientation of a repurposed building or a house mosque, is a little bit off from the actual walls of the building. And so sometimes they actually get it fully wrong, and then it has to be readjusted later. As I think there was a 1925 mosque that there was this problem like that. Or the geography of that space, the prayer hall, is telling us as observers of architecture, the kind of adjustments that had to be made in order to achieve this space of worship. There's a kind of beauty and a poetics of awkwardness in it, if I could invent a little bit of word for it. Do you ever feel like picking that up, that poetics of awkwardness as an indigenization that one holds on to?
No, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I that's something that I do try to sort of not lose, I suppose, in the kind of new formulations that I might be sort of developing, and those new formulations I sort of develop through the drawings as explorations of kind of new kinds of architecture. Haven't necessarily turned them into well, I suppose they kind of come into the buildings that I've done so far, and they haven't necessarily made a building which is a kind of full expression of that idea yet, anyway.
Well, I see the jalis, the screens in some of your buildings in their incompletion or in their scaling differences as actually absorbing that kind of awkwardness in a new, and processing it, I suppose, into a new form.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I'd like to be able to sort of continue. I think that's quite an important characteristic which underpins what this architectural language is and how it has emerged. And I think it would be a loss to lose that. It's also alongside that is the process of kind of iterativeness and the ad hocness of the buildings and the kind of decision making that has gone on over sort of incremental periods, incremental decision making over a period of time. And so I think, there is a danger of erasing that history, which may be maybe that's a kind of natural evolution of when vernacular becomes.
Maybe sometimes people want that history to go as well.
Yeah, exactly. So people could be like, we actually want something shiny and intense and yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I suppose it is complex.
It is complex. Coming back to these three typologies that you identified in your practice, how do you work through the architectural innovations? Because we can talk about poetics of awkwardness, but also there's some deeply innovative stuff happening here between the house mosque, the repurposed non-domestic architecture, and then the purpose-built mosque. And I'm particularly thinking about that house, that row house, which has I think the industrial company that produces locks or something on there. Is that a painting or is that bricks being stamped?
That's recessed into the render work. So it's kind of
relief work. Okay. So how do you kind of think through these three typologies? I know your architectural practice started first, and then you started analyzing it later in your life as you began to research. But then these things keep moving back and forth in some sense. No, so I'm very, very curious.
How do I do what? Sorry, how do
you pick and choose what elements of these three typologies, not to copy so much as to guide your own thinking, your own practice, your own design thinking?
Yeah.
Never have to argue for that typology to your patrons. That's, I guess, also what I'm asking. So they want a new mosque, they want you to fix it up. Do you argue for a historical indigenized typology? mosque typology from Britain?
Yeah, I mean, actually, not explicitly, actually. So in a way, what I might do is that might be the kind of thinking that I'm undergoing myself in terms of developing architectures and, you know, languages and visual responses and so on. But it might not necessarily be how I might talk about the project with a client, actually. So then I may well describe, this is what I've done, and this is where these different ideas have come from. But in a way, partly it's the kind of whether the design works or not, is whether the communities, whether it works for them, whether they look at it and they think this works for us, visually this works for us. So for example, the mosque in Hackney Road, the one with that lettering on, it was a Bangladeshi migrant community, and they said that they didn't really understand my drawings when I was doing the drawings and so on, but they just kind of let me get on with it. And now that it's there, they like it, because it's very they say it's the most distinctive mosque in Tower Hamlets in the borough, for example. They like the fact that people come there and look at it and take pictures of it and so on, and it's given them a certain kind of visibility, which they didn't necessarily think that they had or were seeking, if you like. So in a way, for me, that's a kind of a vindication of the process, is if it works, ultimately, if it kind of works for them. The Aberdeen Mosque, the client there, it was a different scenario, because the client for the Aberdeen Mosque actually came to me because he wanted something which was not a traditional mosque, if you like. But that's the only time really that somebody has actually come and said, you know, I specifically want something which is quite different. And that was because it was driven by a individual family, actually, which is the difference again between a committee as the client and a sort of patron. So most mosques are kind of committee led rather than patron led, and I think that makes a difference as well. Yeah.
I think that one of the things that really struck me is because you sent me Riz Ahmed's video, and going back to the title of our session called An Architect Who, maybe you're an architect, or you're an architect of diasporic longing, and maybe you're the architect of resolving some of that longing. So I wondered how you situated yourself within other Muslim cultural practitioners in England, in Britain, actually. How do you see your practice as not just participating in an urban landscape, but in a larger British Muslim cultural scape that is, of course, situated within the multiculturalism that Britain so intensely embraced before Brexit, at least?
You mean others who design mosques, or just generally?
In general, like how do you, because you connected to Riz Ahmed's video very profoundly, and I did too. I mean, I like his work in general, but I think he's very, he made himself quite vulnerable in that movie, and I think he, in that small film, and then I think he articulated something that's quite profound. And a mosque aestheticizes that experience in a way that he doesn't.
Yeah, I mean, there are people who really are kind of like mosque makers here in the UK, designers, like who are continuously working on mosque projects, and they have done tens of projects around the country, for example. So I'm not one of those. I don't work that prolifically. So I kind of have a handful really and I work on one by one here and there over the years. So I don't necessarily, yeah, it's kind of interesting. And I do, you know, I have sort of interviewed or referenced the work of other designers in my book and so on. So it is very much, yeah, I am sort of on the one hand part of that group as well, that is kind of like making sort of mosques, but also an observer of what they're doing as well in a funny kind of way. So yeah, so I don't really know exactly how I sort of think.
And you're okay with not knowing sometimes.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
I think that's okay. There's questions are developing, and I'll open it up to the audience shortly because we still have you held to your time so beautifully. So I have a couple of more questions, and then I'm going to open it up for the audience. What kind of sacredness do you see in each of these mosque typologies? Because I didn't hear a conversation about that. So I'm really curious, in all your observing acumen and your own emotional depth, what kind of sacredness did you see or experience, or what is sacredness when you design something?
This is an interesting question, because it kind of comes up every now and then in terms of the idea of what is the spiritual or the sacred that is being made. And in all of the projects that I've done, so all the years that I've worked with Muslim communities, nobody has ever said we want a sacred space, or we want a spiritual, atmosphere, or we want, this is a sacred build. So the word sacred has never come up, nor has the word spiritual. And that could be for a number of reasons. I mean, it could be because it's just not used in the kind of lexicon. It's a kind of westernized concept, I suppose, potentially, that there is something which is separate from everyday life, which we call, which has to have a term. And I sort of wonder partly whether that separation doesn't necessarily exist in the same way. So people see their kind of religiosity and religious activities as very much part of everyday life. It's kind of everyday living. And so the mosque, so in that sense, mosques to a large degree are very kind of like functional buildings, and a lot of the way in which a lot of the needs that people have are about how do we fit everybody in. So on Friday we've got people on the street, so we need a bigger space, and I might say, well, wouldn't it be nice to have like a taller double height? No, let's pull the first floor back a little bit, or let's open it up, get some light in, or just make something a bit more with some atmosphere. But people will often be, well, actually we just need space, so let's just do a floor, and then and so on. So there are these kind of slightly painful things that happen. But so it is very the whole kind of conversation around the language and the architecture, I think for me, and it might be, maybe I've placed too much emphasis on it, but for me it has really very much become about the kind of cultural, political, social symbolism of this language, the visual culture, and what the meanings of that within this broader context. But that's also because that architecture doesn't have any religious significance. So the dome, the minaret, the arch, and so on, there's no kind of religious or sacred requirement for any of these things. I think the one thing, because I have thought about this recently, I think the one thing that does sacralize the space is the orientation. And you mentioned that. And I think that's the only thing that is a requirement, is the direction in which you pray. So this twisted sort of geometry that you get in most buildings, because the geometry has to be overlaid into an existing frame, that's where the kind of sacredness, I think, occurs. It's in that kind of, when your sort of, lines of prayer are at odd angles, and you're kind of jammed up against a wall or in a corner to carry out the prayer or something like that, or you can't quite fit everyone in properly because it's such an odd geometry. It's almost like it's in that the sacred happens, because that's the one thing that connects you, the worshipper connects the worshipper to the sacred point on earth, which is, for Muslims, the Kaaba, and then that connects you to this kind of other realm. So the kind of in Muslim thinking, it's the Kaaba that connects you to the kind of heavenly realm. So I think it has to only exist in those lines that are on the carpet. Actually, is where the sort of sacredness happens.
That's a beautiful way of putting it, because in a sense, what's become sacred at that moment is the individual's experience of community, as well as the connection to Mecca, to the Kaaba, and all these things, because you have those row upon row of prayer spaces for each individual, in a kind of in a democratizing, equalizing mode. My last question to you is actually moving you away from the mosque, but to the buildings that you work with or have researched or have put in the middle of your practice. As you said throughout your book and in your presentation, many Muslims in Britain, British Muslims, are working class people. And often they're not very well off, and it's a shared endeavor to make a mosque happen. When I was looking at it, I was also thinking about you having to deal with the histories and the transformation of the white British working class that once were meant to live in those row houses and drink in those pubs and worship in those churches. And I wondered, and your practice, how does the presence of that, like, for example, I read it that the retention of that row house and the relief text on that building, and then connecting it to the intervention you made in the creation of a mosque space that you made, as a kind of negotiation of the layers of working class histories that were converging on that spot. So I was very curious how you thought. I mean, to me, I might be a romantic and I'm perfectly comfortable with that, but I have a great affection for working class histories. So I was very curious what you thought about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I probably have similarly kind of sort of romantic motivations, but the idea of the kind of city as a palimpsest is something that I you know, see value in and kind of richness in, and the buildings do represent those. If the buildings can represent that kind of layering, where the different parts of their histories is retained and maintained, then I find that there's value in that, and there's a kind of richness in that, because there is no newness, I suppose, is what I'm saying. And also the fact that the kind of diasporic communities that you know come in as migrants and work with an existing, are shaped by the existing context into which they come. So the idea of, that's why I sort of think the idea of restoring or recreating is actually, we're actually making things new and reinventing. And I think for me, it's nice to be able to see these different components and you know, contexts, and to have them visible that are part of that process. And that's what the history of the mosque shows, as you know, 80% of them being adapted. That is the history of them. That is the typology. That is what it is, kind of, in a way. And I'm quite interested in just recognizing that and accepting that as that is the typology that we have.
Thank you so much. We have a question. Our first question is from Soda. The Cambridge Central Mosque that was recently shortlisted for the Sterling Prize is a departure from the diasporic forms of Islamic architecture that dominate the mosque in Britain and indeed elsewhere. And it seems, in design terms, a truly revolutionary attempt at defining what a modern mosque could look like, not aping any designs by architects, and is very organic in form as well. What's your opinion of the design, and whether designers have been able to successfully create a new religious, eco-conscious design vocabulary through this structure?
I think for sure the Cambridge Mosque is an important marker in the history of mosque architecture in Britain, not only because of its kind of scale and you know, significance in the town, but because of its architecture as being described here. What I find interesting about that mosque is that it was again, it was kind of spearheaded by a client. It was a client body, obviously the Cambridge Mosque Trust, but this was kind of put together and spearheaded by an English convert to Islam called Tim Winter, whose Muslim name is Abdul Hakim Murad. And he was kind of like effectively acted as the sort of client for the building. So there was, and I think what that does, when you have quite a clear, almost like individual, almost patron-like, you can have a clearer vision about what you want the architecture to be. And so I think a lot of the kind of drive for the Cambridge Mosque came from Tim Winter. He was incidentally, I suppose it's incidental, but his father was a fairly renowned modernist architect in Britain called Charlie Winter. So he sort of probably had some kind of an architectural, you know, sensibility or background. And and he's very much respected as an Islamic scholar here as well. So he's very kind of trained as an Islamic scholar. He serves as a scholar for many people. So very learned person in terms of his religious background, but also in terms of, I think, kind of he's a theologian at Cambridge and so on. And so I think what they've done there is brought together, in one way, I think it's actually quite a traditional building, because the layout of the building follows quite sort of traditional archetypes of Islamic architecture, in terms of, like, there's a garden and then a portico and then a sort of courtyard or entrance hall, as it were, and then the mosque space. So there's it does follow really quite a sort of established syntax. And then it's really the kind of technology of these arches, these kind of like timber decorative arched forms, which create this very distinctive and very elaborate structure. So it's create a religious eco-conscious, and yeah. So I think, in a nutshell, I think it is very successful in what it achieves. I think it negotiates a number of different cultural, historic, religious traditions and trajectories, and sort of has created from that a building which it doesn't quite, it doesn't fully situate itself in any one of those. And I think that's what makes it really quite a successful building. It can be read through any of these different read through a number of different lenses, actually. And I think, again, that's what gives it its significance and its importance. So it will stand as an important point in time in terms of architectural history.
Anal Mehta, and then Sarovar, and then Abu Talha. Anal Mehta says, thank you so much for the inspiring presentation. I'd like you to take this opportunity to ask, what are your thoughts or suggestions for researchers in home countries of diaspora communities to be able to document, connect to studying the similar architecture buildings in their context? Thanks.
Yeah, for recent home countries of the diaspora community, to study. Yeah, I think with any of these kind of studies, it's about very much about kind of field work, really, and sort of you have to kind of generate the material for study first, because often a lot of the material doesn't necessarily exist. So there has to be kind of like this kind of period of actually just going out and visiting places, people, talking to people, seeing what kind of documentary evidence there might be, which might not be much. So I think in any place where these similar studies are being carried out, whether it's in home countries or in other diaspora communities, it's very much the approach, I think, has to be kind of anthropological. So the fieldwork stage has to be a very important part of the methodology of generating content, and then one can start to analyze and interpret.
Sarovar, would you like to ask your question? Is she still there? Okay, maybe she has gone. So I will read Abu Talha Faruqi's question. I'm an architect, teacher, researcher based in Delhi, having worked and researched, worked and researched in the domain of mosque architecture. My question is, how do you feel about the epistemological dangers of evading the manifold agencies and complexities associated with the making or building of mosques, and instead focusing upon the critique of what has been built? In other words, the dangers of ridding the building from its immanent anthropological agents and subjects.
Yeah, good question. I'm just looking for that question. Actually, is it in there?
Yeah, it's in the Q&A.
Okay. Okay, I can't see it myself. Okay, so this is so the danger of reading it as a kind of anthropological object, as opposed to
as an anthropological object, as opposed to epistemological. So there's knowledge. So agencies and complexities would stand in for, I think, for the anthropological approach, which is how you have build up the kindness to address and listen to people and incorporate their things. And what he's asking is, how do you, to put it in more simpler terms, how do you avoid compromising the knowledge that you bring as an architect to such projects? As an architect and as a thinker.
Yeah. Compromising my own.
Yes.
Knowledge.
Yes.
Yeah. I see what you mean. So in terms of like my own kind of like critical judgment over the sort of things that I'm looking at. There's always a balance. I think for me, that's where my work as a designer acts as a kind of, perhaps as a refuge, because in the design process, you can't really have a fully logical explanation of a design process. You sort of have to tap into more kind of sort of personal motivations, or those things which are kind of like less, which are more kind of like coming from a point of authorship, I suppose. So in a way, perhaps I use the kind of use my sort of like design process and design thing as the place in which I can bring my own self or kind of critical voice more actively. Perhaps I don't know whether I've completely understood the.
Well, Abu, would you like to unmute yourself and clarify?
Yeah, hi. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. Yeah, so so my question was this, that, generally whenever we are talking about mosque architecture, Islamic architecture, we are majorly looking at, pieces of architecture and buildings as some kind of art objects which have, which sort of exist in an urban realm, in architectural realm, in a, in sort of some kind of a space, form, syntax kind of a thing. But what is mostly missing in those descriptions is actually some kind of a backstory of, who were the agents, who were the people, what exactly did they want to build, who actually were the makers of, that mosque, that wall, that jali, that window, that door. So all of those kind of things. So the whole process of making, or the whole process of building, and how people and their cultures and all kinds of complexities which humans and which we possess, how about what actually are the dangers when we are evading and sort of avoiding those kind of discussions, and we are sort of looking at a building as something which which sort of exists after it has been built, with respect to many outside kind of forces working on it. So it sort of becomes, the object of critique becomes, gets centered on the product, right, rather than the process. And so the building is sort of considered as something which has been built, and not something which is constantly in the process of building. So I was just trying to understand that, how, because you have a lot of experience teaching as well as practice, how do you personally sort of look at this phenomenon?
And I think it's a very important point that you raise, actually. I mean, and that is, it is a danger of not understanding the processes by which the building has come into being, and the very kind of sort of embeddedness of people in the making of those spaces and of that architecture. And there's probably not enough work done on that. I've sort of done a little bit. I've kind of scratched the surface, if you like. But certainly, I think there should more needs to be done. With the work that we did with the Old Kent Road community for the Biennale, we did, there were sort of extensive interviews with the community there, and there are people that they were sort of very much talking about the way in which they have grown up with that building. Some of the people have you know, they've gone from childhood to adulthood with the building, as it were. And there's an artist that we work with, Julie Marsh, who's continuing to work with the community and sort of documenting, you know, the images and scans that she made of the building previously are going to be kind of looking at how to reuse those in the sort of telling of the story of the building. So it's very dangerous, I think, is the answer, that to sort of ignore, to kind of lose sight of these processes and to concentrate and to sort of fixate only on the sort of objects and products. I think we would lose quite a significant degree of understanding if we did that.
Abu, if you read I hope you get a chance to read both the books that both the 2018 larger publication and the British Mosque catalog from the V&A show. You'll understand that maybe the makers and thinkers of these buildings are central to his project. He may not always know exactly who cut out, let's say, a Mirab Farma to put on top of a particular entrance, but there's a space that's imagined for that person. Sarovar, could you please ask your question, unmute yourself and ask?
Yeah, thank you. Hi. So I'm a fan of your work from Instagram. But besides that, there were just two things that I wanted to bring in. You know, to think of the mosque in England as a part of a milieu and an emergent motif. It's part of a milieu of Indian Ocean, and Islam has always been diasporic in the sense that if you think of the Jews and the synagogue, and if you try and classify synagogue typology, you land up in a muddle, because the synagogue is constantly adapting and absorbing features from here and there, and then also being a synagogue besides it. So the New York synagogue or the Berlin synagogue, they're all they're very different, right? So I tried to do this in Bombay, and I was flummoxed because 300 years of Bombay's history, which had so many diasporic Muslim groups coming in and settling in, had absolutely different typologies, as Annapurna says. So it'll be actually very interesting to think of it as what are the features that they keep and what are the features that they lose, and what is this constant. And I think you do this in your work too, where you are sometimes absorbing the motif of blue tile mosques, etc., the geometric motif, and you're adapting it into an absolutely different materiality and facade. I just thought, I was thinking of, when you were talking about this, I was thinking of the Asian Dub Foundation and their early concerts in 1993, when the dhol came into the disco, right, in London, and it changed everything. And also what happens with the community when it wants to not pass but emerge, where it wants to say that, yes, there is a mosque here. This is not a hidden mosque. This is not a basement mosque. This is not a house mosque. And I think in Europe right now, it's a very different thing that is going on. Like the Dutch mosques are about passing. The German mosques a lot of the mosques are about passing and fitting into that milieu, rather than showing themselves off, because it has become more complicated. While in England, the decolonial moment has happened. So, it would be interesting if you can comment on that. And I had one more point, which now I can't remember.
You can come back and ask it again after Sadia.
Okay.
That's no, thanks, Sarah. But that's a really, what you sort of talked about is really, there's not much more I can add, because you've said it so well, kind of in a nutshell, the issues that are kind of that we're sort of dealing with in terms of like the way in which the kind of the language is used and reused and then deployed in different ways, and then by different sort of communities. And I sort of talked a little bit about this kind of slippage between where architectural languages are drawn from and the communities that are using them. There's a sort of in a way, there's a kind of freedom to that as well, which I sort of quite enjoy as well, that you don't necessarily need to be incredibly sort of like accurate with references and histories and things, and you can actually be quite free, have a certain level of sort of freedom. I think there was a point I was thinking of when you were talking, which I can't completely remember what it was now, but I think yeah, I mean, I think it's I agree with pretty much your summary of the sort of situation, really.
Thank you.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I also found what you said, there's a notion of the visible and the invisible that is constantly on. And that is on in identities and in buildings. It's nearly like a syntagmatic movement, and it's also on in accents. So my British Asian friends, how they speak when they are at home or on the street in Southall, or when they are with other in British spaces, and there's a kind of constant transformation in accent and voice. And I think there is a kind of synchronic movement between aesthetics, language, and identities that your work really throws up fantastically.
No,
So,
thank you. I mean, yeah, thanks for kind of observing that, but also for describing it so well as well. And I think you're quite right. That's yeah, I think that's the thing I was thinking about when you're talking about emergence and visibilities. And so I suppose the kind of thing that part of me that is always afraid of is of losing what we do if we come along as kind of designers and then start taking over the kind of design process of the mosque from the people who built them themselves previously. Are we taking away to a certain extent that that very kind of like difference which they have represented? So the kind of visibility that they have brought, and the kind of differentness, the kind of very much this sort of like, in a way, strangeness, if you like, that they have brought to landscapes and townscapes, is in many ways a staking a claim for an alternative form of representation, and in certain ways a kind of resistant act, in a way I see it as. And I'm afraid to kind of to sort of overwrite that with a more kind of acceptable design language. And I suppose there needs to be always, for me, this discomfort, I suppose, with, yeah, I mean, discomfort in a kind of positive way, but a sort of slight provocation, I suppose, in sort of like opening up a window. These buildings should kind of open up a door or a window to otherness, to kind of alterity in some form. And the danger, I suppose, that I feel somewhere as a designer is, do we close that door if we design too fully, in a way? So yeah, I'm thinking out loud.
I think the question, in a way, to put it in a way that I feel I can understand it very easily, is how much design is enough design? At a point when you swallow up the community that you're building for into your own designing. We should close. I want to just ask you one last question, because Sadia has said that by mistake there's something wrong with her computer and her hand keeps going up. So she apologizes, but that's okay, Sadia. These things happen. Thank you, Sarovar, for your wonderful comments. In conclusion, I just want to ask you, how did it feel to insert yourself into that V&A archive like that?
I mean, to be honest, the V&A archive, I haven't extensively worked with, actually.
Yeah, but your sketch is in there now. Your sketches from your field work are in there.
Oh, I see, into the archive there. Yeah. I mean, that obviously feels good, It feels, yeah, I mean, on a personal level, it's always very satisfying to know that, your kind of work will be, as they say, kept forever. I mean, whatever that means, and be made accessible. I mean, also, I think...
wasn't that also a kind of resistance to, because in a way the V&A set the terms on how Islamic it, how to receive the Islamic it, right? I mean, in the West.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, exactly. I mean, the bigger project is really on how do institutions understand kind of Islamic history, because I think one of the problems I feel is that, you know, Islamic history and Islamic art and architecture and so on is seen as kind of ending in the kind of, you know, maybe the kind of a late Ottoman period. So, you know, possibly mid 19th century, let's say, maybe going to the end of the 19th century is the end of the Islamic period. But actually, my argument is that we're still within it. So what diasporas make here is still part of it's still very much as much a continuation of Islamic art and architecture and culture as you know, the sort of the kind of Islamic Spain was, for example. And we should sort of work out ways of how to incorporate that and understand that. So I think, you know, the V&A work now, not just my drawings, but some of the pieces from the Biennale will now go into the collection as well. So again, that's
also you've digitally printed many of the models of these places, which are also going into the.
Yeah, there will be some digital scans which will go in, but these are the first pieces of, you know, diasporic or British Islamic architecture entering the collection, which is kind of weird that it's so late in a way, but maybe that's just, it's time for these things to start happening.
So I want to thank you so much for being so forthright and sharing your work so kindly and in a fulsome way. And also thank you to the audience for asking such wonderful questions, and also to the Kiran Nadar Museum staff and Akansha Rastogi for hosting this event. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me and for the audience being there and for this really engaging conversation. It's really fantastic to be part of.
Please have a nice evening and a day for you.
Thank you. Yeah, you too. Thanks.
Bye-bye.